Vivid verses.
I have always been good at noticing the small, dishonest things that people do when they think no one is watching closely. It is not paranoia. Paranoia is what happens when you suspect things that aren't there. What I have is the opposite, a quiet attentiveness to things that very much are there that other people miss because they want to miss them. I was making coffee the morning I knew for certain. The kitchen had that particular Sunday stillness, the kind where the refrigerator's hum becomes the only meaningful sound in the apartment, and Adeline was on the phone in the bedroom with the door three-quarters closed. I wasn't trying to listen. I had stopped trying to listen weeks earlier because trying creates strain, and strain is something to listen to can sense. Instead, I had simply learned to occupy the kitchen with the slow rhythms of a man who had no agenda. Pour the water, measure the grounds, set out 2 cups, and let whatever was going to drift through the open seam of the door drift through. What drifted through that morning was the figure 412,000, spoken in her sister's general direction with the casualness of established fact. I poured the water through the grounds. It was the exact number I had given Adeline 6 weeks earlier when she had asked, in passing, what I thought my brokerage account had grown to. I had answered her with a precise figure that was not the real figure. The real figure was rather different. The number I gave her had been chosen carefully, close enough to plausible that it would not invite a follow-up question, distinctive enough that if it ever surfaced anywhere outside the two of us, I would know exactly where it came from. It had surfaced in her sister's ear, in a tone that said this is what he has, not this is what he told me. The distinction, I thought, watching the coffee fill, was the entire shape of the thing. I carried both cups out to the small balcony that looked over the courtyard. I left hers on the side table by the door, so she could find it warm, then sat down on my chair with mine, opened the book I'd been reading slowly for a month, and read 3 pages without absorbing a single sentence. What I was actually doing was running the timeline. 8 months. That was when the questions had begun to bother me, not in a sharp way, but in a way that left a faint metallic taste at the back of the mouth. The questions had a sequence to them. What's your savings rate looking like these days? A few weeks before did your bonus ever clear? A few weeks before you still putting that much into the index fund, or did you shift it? On their own, every one of those questions belonged inside a long relationship between 2 adults who shared a life. Together, in that order, with that frequency, returning always to the same handful of categories: liquid, retirement, real estate, the small inheritance from my grandmother. They formed a survey. I had filled out enough surveys in my life to recognize one when it was being administered to me with a smile and a hand on my forearm. What I had not done, when I noticed, was confront her. Confrontation is the move of a man who needs the other person to admit something. I did not need her to admit anything. I needed to know what she was building, who she was building it with, and what she intended to do with it. None of those questions could be answered by an argument across the kitchen island. All of them could be answered by feeding the survey false data and watching where the false data turned up. So I'd fed her false data, carefully, not lies that contradicted each other. That would have been clumsy, and Adeline was not an unintelligent woman, but lies that formed a coherent alternative version of my finances, internally consistent, large enough to be interesting, small enough to be believable, with a particular distribution across asset classes that I had constructed deliberately so that I would recognize at the moment it left her mouth and entered someone else's. 412,000 was the brokerage line in the version I had built for her. The real brokerage figure was more than twice that. The real total picture was several multiples of what she believed. Adeline came onto the balcony, then in a long gray cardigan with her hair still up from the night, picked up her cup, and kissed the top of my head as she passed. She smelled faintly of the lavender soap she'd started buying at the farmer's market. She sat down across from me, and tucked her feet up under herself. "Who was that?" I asked, turning a page I had not read. "Margot." She's stressed about Henrik again. "What's he doing now?" "The same thing. Spending money they don't have on a car they don't need." I looked at her over the top of the book and smiled the small private smile we use for each other's siblings, and she rolled her eyes and smiled back, and for a half second I felt the reflex of affection I had been having for her without interruption for, well, a while. The reflex did not go away when I noticed what she was doing. That was one of the things that had surprised me most. I had thought, when I first began to suspect, that the suspicion would corrode the warmth. It hadn't. The warmth was still there. It had simply been joined by something else, something colder and more analytical, sitting beside it on the bench, waiting for a turn at the wheel. "What are you reading?" she asked. "The same one. I'm being slow with it." "You're always slow with the good ones." "That's because the bad ones, I just stop." She laughed and looked out at the courtyard. I went back to staring at my page and thinking about money. The thing about restructuring a life's finances quietly is that it can be done. People imagine it cannot, that there are paper trails and joint statements and frozen procedures, but most of what people imagine about other people's finances is borrowed from television. Adeline and I had never married. We had never opened a joint account. We had moved into the apartment together, which was leased in my name 3 years and some months ago. We split groceries and utilities through a small shared app where each of us logged purchases, and the app reconciled at the end of every month, and the larger arithmetic of my life, the brokerage, the retirement accounts, the property my grandmother had left me, the income that arrived in irregular but substantial pulses had never been visible to her except through whatever I chose to tell her. What I had told her for most of the relationship had been roughly true. Vague but true. I'm comfortable. The grandmother thing was generous. I'm careful with it. The kind of statement that closes a topic in a healthy partnership. What I had told her for the past 8 months had been carefully and deliberately false. And in those 8 months, I had also done a great deal of work that she could not see. I had moved the brokerage to a new firm. The old firm had sent paper statements to the apartment every quarter, and although I had never seen Adeline open one, I had also never had any guarantee she didn't. The new firm was paperless, and the login lived behind a password manager she had no access to. The old firm's account was now empty and dormant. If she or anyone else were quietly checking balances by some means I hadn't yet identified, they would see nothing alarming, only stillness. I had retitled the property. My grandmother had left me a small house in a part of the country I rarely visited, and for years I had let it sit, occasionally renting it through a service. The rental income had gone into an account whose name was a variant of mine that Adeline had never seen written down. That account had now become the parent of several smaller accounts, restructured into a trust whose terms I had spent 2 long evenings with an attorney drafting, and the trust no longer had me as a beneficiary on paper in any way that a casual search would surface. The income still flowed, in the end, to me, but the path had gotten long and quiet. I had changed the beneficiary on my retirement accounts. Adeline had never been the beneficiary. In fact, there had been no formal step at any point that would have made her one, but I had still gone through every account and confirmed, line by line, that the people listed were the people I wanted listed. My mother, my brother, a small slice to a charity I cared about. No partner, current or otherwise. I had sold a position I'd held for years and rebalanced into something more liquid. Not because I needed liquidity, but because a liquid portfolio is easier to move quickly if it ever needs to be moved quickly. And the principle of optionality had become, in those months, something I cared about more than I had previously cared about it. And I had begun, quietly, to document. This was the part that felt least like me and most necessary. I was not the kind of man who kept a file. But I had started keeping a file, not on paper, in a folder on a drive she could not access, with a name that would not draw the eye of anyone who happened to glimpse my screen. In the folder were dated notes. September 14th, asked about brokerage growth. I gave figure X. October 2nd, asked whether I was still maxing the 401k. I gave figure Y. October 19th, asked about the rental income and whether I'd ever consider selling the house. I said income was Z and I was undecided. Each note had the figure I had given her, the figure that was actually true, and a brief observation about her demeanor and the conversation surrounding context. There were also, in a separate subfolder, the small handful of incidents that had pushed my noticing from a faint metallic taste to a settled understanding. The first had been 6 months in. She had asked, on a long drive, what my mother's situation was like financially. Was she comfortable? Did she have what she needed? Would she ever need help from me? The questions were not unreasonable. They were the kind of questions a partner thinking long-term might ask. But they were also questions whose answers, in combination with the answers I had been giving about my own holdings, would let someone construct a picture of inheritances both received and anticipated. I had answered with the kind of warm vagueness that good sons give about good mothers, and I had watched, in my peripheral vision, the very slight tightening of her jaw when the answers did not yield a number. The second had been a dinner with Margot and Henrik at their house. Henrik had been, as Henrik tended to be, talking about his own latest scheme, and at one point Margot had cut across him and asked me. The question dropped into the table like a coin into a fountain, whether the thing my grandmother had left me had ever been formally appraised. Just curious, she had said. Henrik's been wondering about doing the same with his uncle's place. I had told her no, it hadn't been formally appraised. I had only the rough number from probate. I had given her, at that table, the rough number from probate that I had given Adeline 3 weeks earlier. The number was, by then, no longer the real one. Margot had nodded in the way of someone confirming a figure she had heard before. That was the dinner I went home from and started the file. The third had been the smallest and the most decisive. Adeline had come back from a coffee with a college friend whose name I did not recognize, and over dinner she had said, with the most casual possible inflection, that her friend's husband had asked his wife to sign a post-nuptial agreement and that the friend had been crushed by it. And what did I think about post-nups in general? She had asked it like someone asking what I thought about a movie. I had said something measured and thoughtful, and she had nodded and changed the subject. And that night, I had lain awake in the dark next to her sleeping body and understood, with the same clarity I had once understood, that the company I worked for was about to lay off a third of its staff, that the questions were not survey questions. They were the early scaffolding of a conversation we were going to have eventually, in which the picture of my life she had assembled would be presented back to me, and a structure would be proposed, and an arithmetic would have to be done. The arithmetic, I had decided then, was going to be done with my numbers, not hers. That was the night I had started restructuring in earnest. Adeline was looking at me from across the small balcony table, and I realized I had been turning the same page back and forth without progress for a while. "You're somewhere else," she said. "I'm in the book." "You're not in the book. You haven't turned a page in 10 minutes. I smiled and closed it. "Fair. Where are you then?" I looked at her, at the genuinely lovely face I had loved without complication for a stretch of time, and had loved with complication for a shorter stretch, and considered the shape of the day I had planned. I had been turning it over for weeks. I had decided, in the end, that the conversation would happen on a Sunday morning, on this balcony, over coffee, with no audience and no pressure. I had decided I would not be unkind. I had decided I would not allow the conversation to become a fight, because a fight was a structure she might be able to use, whereas calm clarity was a structure she could not. I had decided, and I had been waiting for the moment when the decision and the day aligned. I had not expected it to be today, but I had heard her say 412,000 into the phone an hour earlier, and that felt in some small private way like a signal that the timing had become its own thing now. I was thinking, I said, that I want to talk to you about something, actually. Her face did the thing it did when she became attentive, a slight stilling, a settling. And inside my own head I saw, very clearly, the small cold shift of a woman who thought she was about to receive something useful. "Okay," she said. "It's about money." "Okay." She set her coffee down. "Nothing bad," I said. "Nothing's wrong. I just realized that I've been a little vague with you about my situation for a long time, and I think we're at the point where you should have the actual picture." "Oh," she said, and her face did several small things at once that she did not realize were visible. The stilling first, then the very slight lift at the corner of the mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the muscle preparation for one. Then, fastest of all, the flicker of focus in the eyes, the look of a person whose internal spreadsheet has just opened in a new tab. I noted all of it. I did not show that I had noted it. Yeah, she said. "I'd like that. I think that's a good idea. Is now okay?" "Now is great." She tucked her feet further under herself and put both hands around her cup and gave me her whole, careful, focused face. I started with the brokerage. I gave her the actual current balance. I watched her register it. The number was more than double the figure I had been giving her over the previous months, and it was not adjacent to that figure. It was a different order of size. The face she made was the face of a person doing arithmetic in real time and discovering that the arithmetic does not balance. She said, "Oh, that's grown a lot." "It hasn't grown a lot, no. It's been roughly that for a while." "Oh." I let the O sit between us for a moment. I moved on to the retirement accounts. I gave her the real numbers there, too. The 401k from the current job, the rollover IRA from 2 jobs ago, the small Roth I've been quietly funding since I was 23. The total was substantially larger than what I'd told her in our few prior conversations on the subject. I gave her the figures cleanly, without flourish, the way you would tell someone the time. She said, I thought you said the 401k was." "I know what I said." "Oh." I moved on to the property. I told her what the rental income actually averaged, closer to 4 times what I told her over the spring, and I told her what the most recent informal valuation from a realtor had come in at, which was a number I had never given her in any form. I told her about the trust the property now sat inside in 2 sentences without going into the structure. "It's held in a trust now. I did that earlier this year." Her hands had tightened a fraction on her cup. "When earlier this year?" "A few months ago. You didn't mention it." "I didn't know." I moved on to the cash position, the high-yield savings, the money market, the small reserve I kept in a credit union for reasons that were sentimental rather than rational. The numbers there were, again, several times what I had ever given her. I gave them to her in the same flat tone, like reading off ingredients. I had been speaking for perhaps 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, I had given her, accurately and completely, the full picture of my finances. I watched her face do the work. The thing about watching someone's face do that kind of work is that it tells you very quickly what kind of work the face has been expecting to do. A person who had no prior assembled picture of my finances would have responded to these numbers with mild surprise, mild interest, perhaps even a kind of warm congratulations. "I had no idea. That's wonderful. You've been quietly impressive about all this." That was the script of someone receiving the information for the first time. Adeline was not running that script. Adeline was running a different script. Her face was performing the small, frantic adjustments of a person whose existing model is being violently overwritten and who is trying to do the overwriting without showing the strain. The eyes were doing one thing. The mouth was doing another. The hands had gone very still around the cup, in the particular way hands go still when their owner is afraid that any movement will give something away. She said, "That's That a lot more than I. Then you what? Then I realized. I let sit between us for a moment, too. The kindest thing I could do for her, I had decided some weeks earlier, was not to drag this out. There is a particular cruelty in making a person watch you slowly arrive at a conclusion they have already understood you to be arriving at. It prolongs the moment the bone is set. I had decided, when I had planned this conversation in my head, that I would not prolong it. Adeline, I said. She looked at me. I noticed pretty early on, I said, what you were doing. Her face went still in a way faces do not go still by accident. I kept my voice gentle. There was nothing to be gained by anything other than gentleness, and there was a great deal to be lost. Anger would have made her defensive, and a defensive Adeline would have produced a counter-narrative within 30 seconds. Coldness would have given her a story to tell her sister later about how cold I had been, which would have allowed her to relocate the moral weight of the conversation. Pleading was not in my repertoire, and would not have been credible if I had attempted it. The only available register was the one I had chosen. Calm, matter of fact, neither warm nor cold. The register of a man delivering information he has already finished feeling about. The questions, I said, over the last, I don't know exactly when it started. 8 months ago, maybe a little longer. They got specific in a particular way. They got sequential. They came back to the same handful of subjects. They didn't feel like the questions a person asks because they're curious about their partner's life. They felt like the questions a person asks when they're trying to assemble a complete picture. She started to say something. I held up one hand very slightly, and she stopped. I'm not going to make you defend yourself, I said. I'm not asking you to. That's not what this is. I don't. I know. She closed her mouth. I noticed it, I said, and instead of saying anything, I started giving you numbers that weren't true. Not big lies. Small ones. Plausible ones. I picked numbers that were close enough to real that they wouldn't trip anything for you, and distinctive enough that I'd recognize them if they ever showed up somewhere else. And then I waited. I watched her process waited. This morning, I said, I heard you tell Margot that my brokerage was at $412,000. The color in her face did the small shifting thing color does when blood is being redirected by an autonomic nervous system that has just realized it is in trouble. 412,000, I said, is a number I gave you 6 weeks ago. It isn't a real number. I made it up. I knew I made it up because I wrote it down at the time. I wrote down all of them. Every figure I gave you over the last 8 months, alongside the real figure, alongside the date and the context. I didn't do that to use against you. I did it because I needed to know if my hypothesis was right, and I needed a record I could check against. She said nothing. Her eyes had filled, but the fill was of a particular kind. Not the wet welling of grief, but the wet brightness that comes when a person is calculating very hard and very fast, and the calculation is not going well. This morning was the confirmation, I said, not the discovery. The discovery was a long time ago. This morning was just clean. The number was exact. You said it like a fact. So that's that, I guess. Adam, she said. She had not used my name like that in a long time. It had a particular intonation, the intonation of someone who is reaching for a tool that has worked before. I'm not finished, I said gently. You should hear the rest before you say anything, because I don't want you to say something you can't take back. She nodded once. In the months since I noticed, I said, I've also been doing some other things. I moved the brokerage. The old account is empty. I retitled the house. That's what the trust is. I rebalanced. I updated beneficiaries, although you were never one. I changed the locks on a few things you didn't know had locks. None of that was punitive. I want you to understand that. It was just protective. I didn't know what you were doing with the picture you were building. I didn't know who you were building it with. I didn't know whether there was someone advising you or whether it was just a personal project you were running on your own. I still don't know. I haven't tried to find out, and I'm not going to try to find out because I don't actually need to know. The shape of it was enough. She was crying now in a quiet way that I noted, but did not respond to. Crying is an event that occurs in conversations like this one, and the only useful thing to do with it is to neither punish it nor reward it. I kept my voice the same. The picture you were building, I said, was based on numbers I gave you. Those numbers were wrong. So the picture was wrong, which means whatever you were planning to do with the picture, whatever conversation you were going to have with me eventually, or with someone else about me, or whatever proposal you were going to bring to the table, none of it was actually about my life. It was about a life I described to you that doesn't exist. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think it's the most important thing I'm saying. You haven't actually been working on me. You've been working on a fiction. She put her cup down very carefully. Her hand was not quite steady. I don't, she said. I don't know what you think I'm not going to argue this with you, I said, still gently. I'm not going to make you confess to anything, and I'm not going to itemize what I think was happening. You know what was happening. I know what was happening. The numbers know what was happening. We don't need to do the part where we pretend that we don't all know. She started to cry harder, in the way a person cries when crying has become the only available move. I waited. The coffee had cooled in my cup. Down in the courtyard, a door opened and closed, and a small dog began barking at something only it could see, and the late autumn light came across the iron of the railing in a flat, clean sheet. What do you want? She said finally. The voice was small, and the question was real. It was, I noticed with a kind of cold respect, the first direct question she had asked me all morning. I want you to move out, I said. Not today. I'm not going to do that to you. By the end of the month. I'll help you find somewhere if you need help. I don't want it to be ugly. I don't want either of us to spend the next year telling people a version of this that makes the other person sound like a monster, because neither of us is a monster. You did something that I couldn't continue with, and I responded in a way that, I think, was as fair as it was possible to be. I gave you 8 months of opportunities to ask me for the truth instead of trying to extract it. You didn't take any of them. That's not a crime. It's just information. I wasn't out of line. I wasn't out of my... I looked at her and I let her see, just for a second, that I knew exactly what was about to be assembled and that I was choosing, out of a kind of leftover affection, not to make her assemble it. Don't, I said, quietly. Please don't. Whatever you're about to say, don't. Because if you say it, I'll hear it. And once I've heard it, I won't be able to keep this conversation as kind as I'm trying to keep it. And I like to keep it kind. She closed her mouth. We sat there for a long time. I cannot say how long. Long enough for the light to shift on the railing. Long enough for the dog to stop barking and for someone, somewhere across the courtyard, to begin practicing the same 4 bars of a piano piece over and over, badly. Long enough for my coffee to go fully cold, for hers to do the same, for both of us to understand that we were not going to drink any more of it. How long have you known? She said. About 8 months. And you just... Yes. For 8 months. Yes. She stared at me. There was a quality to the stare that I had not seen on her face before, and I realized after a moment that it was the look of a person who was, perhaps for the first time in our entire relationship, actually seeing me. Not the version of me she had been talking to, or the version of me she had been describing to other people, or the version of me she had been planning around. The actual person. The person who had been there the whole time, watching her while she had been watching the version of him she had assembled. It was not a pleasant look. It was not a hostile look either. It was the look of recognition arriving very late, when most of the room has already gone dark. Who is it? I said. She didn't answer. It doesn't matter, I said. I don't actually need to know. I was curious, that's all. It's not, she began, and then stopped, because the next word was going to be a lie, and we had agreed, without agreeing, that we were not going to do lies anymore. Okay, I said. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The cardigan sleeve came across her cheek in a long gray arc. "I never," she said and stopped again. "I know," I said, although I didn't know what she had been about to say, and I suspected she didn't either. She stood up. She stood up in a slow, uncertain way, like a person standing up after a long flight, when the legs aren't sure they remember the work. "I'm going to," she said, and gestured vaguely at the apartment. "Okay, I think I'll go to Margot's for a few days, while I figure out that's fine, and then by the end of the month." "Yes." She nodded. She stood there for another moment, not moving, looking at me with the same late, dark recognition. "Adam," she said. Was any of it?" She didn't finish the question, but I knew what the question was. I had known it would come. I had thought about my answer in advance, because I had wanted, when the moment arrived, to be able to give her a true answer instead of a generous one or a punishing one. I considered her, in the cardigan, with her hair coming down out of the loose knot at the back of her head, with the wet on her cheeks and the cup still untouched on the table beside her. "Yes," I said. "A lot of it was. That's the part that's been hard." She made a small sound. I'm not sure what kind of sound it was. Then she turned and went inside, and I heard the soft slide of the bedroom door being closed, and I sat on the balcony alone with 2 cold coffees and a book I was not going to finish today. I did not feel triumphant. I want to say that clearly, because if I have made it sound like a man congratulating himself, I have written it wrong. There was no congratulation. The hypothesis had been confirmed, and the structural work had been done in time, and the conversation had been delivered without becoming a brawl, and all of that was fine. All of that was the minimum. None of it added up to anything like satisfaction. What it added up to was the particular tiredness that comes after you've spent 8 months being 2 people at once. The man living the life, and the man watching the man live the life, taking notes, making moves, preparing. I picked up the cold coffee and held it without drinking it. The piano across the courtyard had moved on to a different 4 bars, equally bad. Somewhere in the apartment behind me, Adeline was beginning, I assumed, to pack a bag. I thought about the file on the drive. I would not need it now. I had built it in case the conversation went sideways, in case she had decided to make claims I would have to refute, in case there had been someone behind her whose involvement would have required documentation. None of that had happened. The conversation had gone the way I had hoped it would go, which was the way these conversations go when the person on the other side of the table understands, in the end, that they have been outworked. There was a kind of, I don't want to say respect. That isn't quite right. But there was a recognition between us in those last few minutes that we had both been doing something serious, and that I had simply been doing it longer and more carefully. I would delete the file, I decided. Not today. In a week, maybe. Once she had moved her things out. Once the practical work of disentangling was done. There was no reason to keep the record after the record had served its purpose. Keeping it would mean keeping a part of me that I had only become because the situation had required it, and I did not want to keep that part of me beyond its usefulness. I had liked, for most of my life, being the kind of man who didn't keep files on the people he loved. I wanted to go back to being that man, and I knew that the only way to do that was to put the tools down once the work was finished. I sat on the balcony for another long while. The piano stopped. The light moved further along the railing. Eventually, I heard the front door open and close, softly, and I knew without turning that she had left with a small bag and that the larger work of leaving would happen in pieces over the coming weeks. I stayed where I was. After a time, I picked up both cups and carried them inside and poured them down the sink. I rinsed them. I set them upside down on the drying rack. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and I noticed, with a small, distant interest, that my hands were perfectly steady. They had been steady the whole time. I had wondered, in the days leading up to this, whether they would be. It was useful to know that they had been. I went back to the balcony picked up the book, and opened it to the page I had been pretending to read for an hour. This time I actually read it.
Thanks for listening.